Good afternoon, guys. It's good to be back with you, and I hope you had a wonderful July 4th holiday. As you can imagine, July 4th has always been among my favorite holidays because of the great patriotic occasion to celebrate America's birthday and the virtues of the American founding. I hope that you all were able to celebrate yourself by spending some time with family and watching some great fireworks shows, and in general, just doing all kinds of things that help us to celebrate the greatness of living in the United States. It has been over a week since my last talk with you, and that is precisely because we had our 1 week break. I wanted to let you know that your paper grades will be in shortly, within the next day or two, because I have started those. I, like you, kind of wanted to use the break to take a little bit of time off, but I'm going to get through your papers very quickly. And I also wanted to let you know, just in brief, what we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks. So in our last units, we were looking at the foundational principles of the American order, especially as they were relayed by founders on both the Anti-Federalist and Federalist side of the aisle. We've looked at the American Revolution's understanding of Republican government and what that meant to the people who challenged Great Britain on that great day in July 4th, 1776. We have also looked at the Republican vision of the Articles of Confederation as it was explicated by Anti-Federalist authors such as Brutus, and the revised republicanism of the Constitution as it was defended by the leading framers such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Today's discussion is going to look at something more particular than those more general concepts. In today's discussion, we're going to be exploring the legislative branch. And in our next week's discussion, we're going to look at the executive branch. This is going to set us up for an exploration of the judiciary in the week that is after the executive branch week. So that's a brief window of just what the agenda is for today and next week. As far as your weekly agenda, do keep in mind you have a quiz coming up this Sunday, I believe. And I wanted to just go ahead and immediately let you know that there's a few things that you should know for it that don't really fit that naturally into this lecture, so I'm going to try to just say them now. The reason they don't fit that naturally into this particular lecture is just because they're based on the reading by my old professor Thomas West in his Vindicating the Founding book, and it's a valuable reading to be sure, but it's not quite as focused on legislative power and what that entails. So here's the deal. Most of the quiz questions I'm going to assimilate into this lecture in some way throughout the lecture, so if you watch it, hopefully you will be well prepared for the quiz. But right up front, I'm going to tell you a couple things that you should know for the quiz that are not really about legislative power or anything like that, just so that you still get them in the lecture. So the first thing you need to understand to do well in the quiz is the concept of historicism. That's like the word history, but attached to a ism. So historicism. We're going to return to this concept in more detail when we get to the progressives and their criticisms of the founding. But in short, you should know that this idea has a very elevated view of history. Such an elevated view, in fact, that it regards every man as a prisoner of his own historical time period. The way Hegel, who was a great historicist philosopher, puts it once, is every man is a child of his time. Every man is a slave of his time. This idea means that you as an individual cannot access any transcendent truths about political life. Moral and political truth is always going to change because history is always changing. And so what might be your rights in one given age are not going to be your right in another age. This is an idea that very much informs progressive criticisms of the founders, because you're going to see that they basically reject the idea of unalienable rights because they think that it's unhistorical. As you can imagine, this idea is closely connected to what's known as relativism, the idea that moral truth changes with time and that it's not subject to the same laws of fixity that something like gravity would be. So another thing you should know for the quiz is look for the discussion of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What was her Declaration of Sentiments about, and what was its relationship to the founding? This is in the same section where Dr. West goes over how the founders sought to protect the rights of women. So consider the question of whether or not the Declaration of Independence provision, all men are created equal, applies to women or not. Did the founders see women as human beings who possess natural rights, or did they not include them under the all men are created equal category? So that's another thing that you should keep in mind for the quiz, that unfortunately I can't sort of assimilate into this lecture that naturally, so I wanted to just get it up there, up front, and out of the way. So the rest of the lecture is going to focus on the legislative power, and I will integrate quiz content into it just as we talk about things. So hope you find this discussion all very interesting, because it is a very important topic for us to understand. So the first thing I want us to consider before we get into the legislative power in the Congress specifically is just why all this business about separating powers in the first place? After all, does it not just make things go very slowly? Does it not divide power and make power irresponsible because you don't know necessarily who's to blame if a law doesn't get enforced or adjudicated or passed in the proper way? So why have this business of a separation of powers at all? Well, here's the reason. The separation of powers between the executive branch, which enforces the law, the legislative branch, which makes the law, and the judicial branch, which adjudicates or interprets the law, is a basic principle of constitutional government, not only for the founders, but really for us, too. The founders recognized, using the lessons of history, that if you concentrate all of these powers in one man, or even in one body of people, this is going to be a recipe for disaster and the abuses of liberty. So let's consider the following thought experiment. I always like to use this in my Intro to American Politics classes to highlight the importance of this concept. So I'm very good at coming up with names for individuals, as you can tell by what I'm about to say. So imagine a guy named Johnny Jones. Yeah, so Johnny Jones, our friend, he has been given the powers of an absolute dictator for one day. He has the legislative power. He can write whatever law he wants. He has the executive power, so he can enforce that law in whatever way he wants. And he also has the judicial power to interpret and adjudicate that law when it is disputed. So it turns out that our friend Johnny Jones, he really has a hate-on for a fellow named Peter Peterson. Johnny Jones versus Peter Peterson, the rivalry of a lifetime, right? Well, Johnny Jones, he draws up with his newfound power a law that has the following provision. It is hereby a crime to have the name Peter Peterson. So Peter Peterson is in a bit of a pickle, isn't he? Yeah, but here's the thing. Johnny Jones, he only really has a hate-on for this particular Peter Peterson. So he decides that he's only going to enforce it against that one individual. So he's written this broad, sweeping law that could be subject to tons of application to anyone with that name, and he's only enforcing it against that one single person. So he's kind of arbitrarily picking and choosing who's going to be targeted by this law. Any other person with that name is off the hook. Well, if Peter Peterson doesn't like this system, he can look forward to pleading his case at the court of Johnny Jones. I probably don't need to tell you, will he receive a fair trial? Of course he's not going to receive a fair trial. It's going to be a trial akin to the one you see in Alice in Wonderland, the old story by Lewis Carroll, later adapted by Disney. The trial where the Queen of Hearts says Alice is guilty, even though the Queen of Hearts has no evidence of this, but she's guilty because the Queen says so, right? So this system of fused powers, where the same person or the same group makes the law, enforces the law, and then interprets the law, you can see that this is a recipe for arbitrary government. This example sounds kind of goofy, but it's really not so goofy. These kinds of things have happened all the time in history. It's exactly the kind of thing the founders were worried about. So the founders want to avoid this kind of arbitrary government by dividing the functions of government so that a different body is writing the law, a different body is executing it, and then a different body is adjudicating disputes under it. It's going to make it more likely that the law is going to be drafted not with just a particular person or group of people in mind that need to be targeted. And it's going to avoid the problem of tyranny much better. So under this system of separated powers, it is unsurprising that the legislative power is really the key ingredient here. So this is the body that's going to be the most closely attuned to the wishes of the people. It's the body that the founders believed would be the most trustable. It's going to be the body that is making standing laws that fit not only for a particular few days or a particular week or a particular month, but laws that really stand indefinitely until revised, or at the very least much more standing and permanent than edicts from an executive or a judiciary could possibly be. The legislative power was seen as significant even at the time of the American Revolution. Remember that in many ways, the American Revolution was a battle over the British system's disregard for the rights of American legislatures. Remember that if you read the Declaration of Independence, you see all these grievances that the founders have with the way the king has done things like move legislative bodies to places that are too distant from the people, places that are unusual or that the people cannot convene in. Or the king has even dissolved legislative bodies. And so to the founders, the legislative power was so important that it was worth fighting an American Revolution for. Remember that the cry was not no taxation, period. It was no taxation without representation. Because the idea was that taxation is only liable to be just and acceptable if it is imposed by people that you as a citizen are electing to safeguard your liberties. And so legislatures meant an awful lot to the founders, and yet they mean less and less to us today. So I want to talk a moment about that. So even though the Congress was designed to be the most important branch of the Constitution, or the most important branch under the Constitution, a fact that you can see by Article 1 of the Constitution, which deals with the structure of the Congress being the one that was the longest part of the whole Constitution, as well as the one that caused the most fierce division at the Constitutional Convention. Despite the importance of the Congress to the founders, polls today often show that Congress's approval rating is in a state of kind of unhappy collapse. So remember that Joe Biden, he had historically unpopular approval ratings because they were something like 38% in some of his very bad polls. So 38%, 39% of Americans approved of him. These were considered very low scores for a sitting president. Well, the president, even an unpopular president like Biden, he still has it better when compared to where Congress often sits. So many polls that come out, they show Congress has approval ratings that dip under 10% sometimes. Often they never get above 15%. So if 39% is historically bad for a president, well, Congress is doing even worse. Here's a funny poll that I read from several years ago. So in 2013, one poll said that Americans had a more positive view of traffic jams, cockroaches, and Genghis Khan, the Mongolian dictator who committed genocide against his people. So they had a more positive view of traffic jams, cockroaches, and Genghis Khan than they did of the American Congress. Fortunately, in this public opinion poll, the Congress did just narrowly beat out North Korea in its approval ratings. So I'll let you be the judge of whether that's really a great thing that Congress, as unpopular as it was in this poll, it could still just barely beat out this tyrannical dictatorship of North Korea. Right. So as funny as that poll is, it highlights that Congress today is widely seen as broken. People on both sides of the political aisle don't really like it very much. They don't really understand how it works or whether it works. And virtually no one believes that the Congress really works for them. And to the founders, this would be deeply disturbing, because the founders and the men who wrote the Constitution, they thought that if a legislature was not well designed, a republic would not be workable, because the legislative body is the vehicle that is most liable to really speak for the interests of the whole people. It's a legislature which is going to protect the people and that they can trust to represent them. The founders were not worried that the legislature would be too weak. They were worried that it might be too strong, because it would be too in sympathy with the people, and therefore they broke it up into two houses, a House and a Senate, in order to slow it down a little bit and force it to be more deliberative. We'll talk more about that when we get to our discussion of the Federalist Papers. So we need to just abstract a little bit here and try to understand why even have representative government, because some people doubt whether a body of representatives convening in a legislature, maybe that's not really such a great thing after all. For example, many Americans today, they might be happy if Congress would kind of just get out of the way and hand us over to a president who's directly elected and can just speak for the whole people. Maybe something like an elected dictatorship would be more efficient at handling state affairs. Because in Congress you have so much slowness. You have difficult action in moments of crisis. Congress is full of parochials who are narrowly interested in doing what their district wants, and maybe not always acting fast, right, for the larger national good. Congress is often willing to stress compromise and consensus rather than radical change. So this is a belief that many of the progressives then and now have had about the Congress. Just get Congress out of the way and invest more power in the executive branch, in the president, but also in the president's the administrative state, the bureaucracy that the president has in a way at his disposal. We're going to see that that's actually a more complicated story than meets the eye. But in general, this has been the thought process that has undergirded the shift away from the legislature into the executive branch. The legislative branch is no longer the biggest of our branches. The executive branch is technically bigger if you consider the millions of bureaucrats that we have in the federal government, and it's also more powerful than the legislative branch. Often presidents basically make law without going to Congress to actually get legislation passed, because they know that that process is very difficult. And so the founders totally rejected this idea. Why? Why did the founders believe that we really need representative government if we're going to have effective Republican government? Well, the founders thought that representation, it forces people who come from different walks of life, different regions, different localities, and even different interests, right? You know, some representatives might have a background as soldiers, others as farmers, others as manufacturers, all these different interests. Well, it forces people from all these different walks of life to come together in one place and collaborate in the process of lawmaking. What does that do? Well, when you think about it, it forces deliberation, it forces consensus, and it forces accommodation between interests, between all the different kinds of people who live in the nation. In this way, representative government is going to be a better reflection of the will of the people than a more directly democratic system, even one where 51% of the voters, they get to choose their elected dictator who does things for them, and then they get it, right? When you think about that, what would that do? Well, it would prioritize king numbers. It would prioritize just the mob of people in the big cities, and everyone else would get left behind. And that's what the founders wanted to avoid. They wanted representation because it forces a process to take place where all kinds of people are represented. And it's not just the big populated centers, but it's all kinds of places that have their representatives. Certainly the big cities also have representatives, and they even have more representatives, but they should be part of a larger whole. They shouldn't be the only ones that matter, which is what often happens if you have simply a direct democracy kind of system. So I want us to take away from this lecture that while representative government is certainly slower than direct democracy, this is actually a feature. It's not a bug. It gives the legislative process a measure of wisdom and deliberation that it otherwise would not have. Representative government was designed by the founders to represent all the people, and this is important. It represents all the people, not just the voters. This is one of the problems with those kinds of direct democracy systems where 51% of the voters want something and they get it. In addition to the fact that often violates the rights of the 49%. Well, another thing to consider is that it's only 51% of the voters making the big decisions. What about the people who choose not to vote? Well, representative government ensures that a representative has a constituency. He has all those people who live in his district that he has to care about and that he has to try to make legislation with a view towards. And so representative government is more likely to be something that protects the interests of all the people, not just the voters. We're going to talk more about Federalist, anti-Federalist disagreements over Republican government, and I want us to understand once again that the big disagreement here is over means. It's not really over ends. Both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists believe that at the core of Republican government is the idea that government should work for the people and achieve the common good. The big disagreement is over whether the Constitution's design for the House of Representatives and the Senate actually does these things. The Federalists believe that the Constitution's design for the Congress is brilliant. The Federalists regarded representative government as an improvement over the direct democracies of the ancient world. They believed that it was an indispensable part of the new science of politics, and they felt that even if it were practically possible to do something like direct democracy, then representative government would still be superior. The Anti-Federalists, however, they saw representative government as a necessary evil, not as something that was a positive good. They saw representation as something that was practically necessary when you have a large republic, where it's impossible for all the people in the whole nation to convene in one single place to legislate directly. But they still thought representation should approximate the immediate wishes of the people as much as possible. And if that sounds abstract, it actually has a great impact on how they see the ideal representative. Federalists see a trustee as the ideal representative. What this means is that they see representatives as people who should serve the common good and act according to their own convictions about what is right for the nation. A good representative leads the people. He doesn't simply rubber stamp whatever the people think is good at any given moment. And so representatives who are trustees are happy to vote their conscience because they think it's right for the nation, even if their own constituents disagree with them. Now, they could always be punished for that in the next election, and this is how this is something that they have to fear for. They could lose their seat if they don't have several other decisions they can point to that very much are in keeping with the spirit of their people. But delegate representatives are more along the lines of mirrors. This is what the Anti-Federalists like. Delegate representatives are those who are willing to vote against their own personal convictions if it closely matches with what the constituents they have want. So these representatives don't rock the boat. They don't try to make their people think about issues differently than they already do. They would feel that that's undemocratic. They were sent there to mirror the wishes of their people, and so they can't be voting according to their own conscience if it's against what their people want. The Anti-Federalists are more in keeping with that spirit. Another way of thinking about this debate, this is something I wanted to mention just because there's a quiz question about this. I'm not sure why, because I think the trustee-delegate dynamic is a lot more important and interesting. But in any case, the quiz asks you about 4 theories of representation. I don't want to spend any time on this, but I want to just briefly say something about it. So, formalistic representation is about procedure. Can representatives be punished if constituents don't like what they do? Symbolic representation is about whether the representative is accepted by those that he represents. Do they have some kind of appreciation for him or see him as legitimate? Descriptive representation is about the question, very much like this mirror or delegate theory of representation. Does the delegate or does the representative resemble those that he represents? So to think of this, descriptive representation, something like a majority-minority district where 90% of the citizens are black, so you should have a black representative. That's how many people think about the makeup of representative government today. And then finally, substantive representation. This is closely aligned to the trustee idea. Do the actions of the representatives serve the interests of their constituents? And so there sometimes is a tension between these 4 things, but the main thing that I think is important here is the trustee versus delegate consideration. Anti-Federalists care more about the delegate theory because they want representatives to mirror public opinion. Federalists, though, they are more in keeping with the trustee model, which is more in the substantive theory of representation. And they're in keeping with the trustee model precisely because, remember, the Federalists are all about the dangers of pure democracy. They sometimes fear mass opinion and want to check it somewhat. So I want to move on now to the anti-federal understanding of the Constitution, and not just the Constitution, but specifically their understanding of the legislative power. I think it's important to begin with the anti-feds here because in many ways the Federalist authors are responding to the anti-federalist criticism. So we should try to understand the anti-fed criticisms as they are relayed in Brutus number 4 and Brutus number 16 before we move into the Federalist response to those and similar criticisms. So there's basically one core assumption that undergirds every criticism that the anti-feds make about the House of Representatives and the Congress generally, but especially the House of Representatives. There's the assumption the anti-feds have that you just have too few representatives trying to represent too many people. So I actually got that mixed up on the PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that. Let me change that. You're going to have too few representatives trying to represent too many people. So it's the other way around from what it originally looked like. So it should be fixed now. So you have a situation where, as Brutus in Brutus number 4 puts it, so small a number cannot resemble the people or possess their sentiments and dispositions. What's the concern here? Well, Brutus and the Anti-Federalists say that if you have this system where you have a few representatives at the top trying to represent a lot of people at the bottom, you're going to have an ever-expanding gap between representatives and represented, between rulers and ruled. Representatives are going to be increasingly removed from their constituents. They're going to become wealthier and more oligarchical than the common men that they're supposed to be representing. Ultimately, this is going to lead to tyranny. Not a tyranny of the majority, as the Federalists had feared, but a tyranny of the minority, a tyranny of the wealthy elites who are all dominating the Congress and kind of locking out the average Joe. It's worth mentioning, I think I mentioned this in the Anti-Federalist lecture, that when Americans today complain about the, quote, Washington establishment, they're referring to something very much like this. They're referring to representatives who spend a lot of time in D.C., they forget where they came from, they don't really serve their own constituents anymore, and they use politics primarily to advance their own financial interests rather than serve their people. This is something that's very anti-federal in spirit. Not that practice, I mean the criticism of that practice. So the Washington establishment. When people criticize that, there's a kind of spirit of anti-federalism in their criticism, that there's this ever-growing gap between the rulers and the ruled. Our leaders are not really like us in important respects, and we can't really trust them anymore. And so I want to sort of look at why they feel this way. So we've already seen the debate over the extended republic. Well, that is also connected here. So Brutus and Anti-Federalists say that with a large republic is going to come more diversity of interests, more diversity of culture. And it's going to be harder for representatives to represent people because their district has so many different people in them that a representative can't possibly represent them. So think about it this way. You have a big district, and 10% of the population is Buddhist, 10% is Catholic, 50% is, or 30% is secular, 25% is Protestant, and the others are all kinds of other religions, right? Well, if a representative is one of those sects, it'll be hard to represent all of them because it's a big and diverse district with a lot of people. Well, the Anti-Federalists say that's going to make it harder for representatives to really connect with their constituents. And so in a way, Brutus is warning about the same thing Madison celebrated. Madison had celebrated the extended republic because he said that if you have this diversity of interests in a large republic, it's going to lead to representatives who were going to be higher quality people. They're going to be the kinds of representatives who can refine and enlarge public views, as he puts it. And they can lead the people. But Brutus says that if you have representatives who are too unlike their people, you're going to no longer have the necessary amount of trust and affection that a good government depends upon in order to survive. Brutus wonders, too, what's going to happen to the citizen legislators. We have in many circles this sort of idealization of the average Joe who goes to Washington and shakes things up and goes there and brings his kind of common sense hometown values to a corrupt and sinister system. This is a theme in the famous movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The citizen legislator who has virtue and can go and bring his hometown values to Washington and shake the boat in a positive way. Well, Brutus says you're going to have less and less of that, and that's by design, because the constitutional system doesn't really want the citizen legislator. It wants the better sorts of men, right? The elites, the wealthy people that are going to be the more likely to win election in this large republic. So here's how Brutus puts it in Brutus number 4. He says, "The people of this state," New York he is speaking of, "will have very little acquaintance with those who may be chosen to represent them. A great part of them will, probably, not know the character of their own members, much less that of a majority of those who will compose the Federal Assembly. They will consist of men whose names they have never even heard, and whose talents and regard for the public good they are total strangers to. And they will have no persons so immediately of their choice so near them, of their neighbors and of their own rank in life, that they can feel themselves secure in trusting their interests in their hands." And so you're going to have less and less of those representatives who live in your neighborhood and who have gone to your daughter's baseball games and who have visited your family get-together in the backyard. And you're going to have more of those uppity elites who you never even met. You've never even had the chance to meet. And so you don't really have that same amount of trust for them. You're always going to be looking at representatives with a lot of suspicion because you don't know who they are and you don't know that they really want to look out for you. Whereas Madison wanted representatives to be better than their constituents and to lead them to think about issues in a deeper way, Brutus says this is a recipe for something like an aristocracy or an oligarchy. The only people who are going to win elections in this large extended republic are going to be those who have a lot of wealth, people who are much unlike the rest of the people. One interesting complaint that Brutus has that in some ways is inconsistent with elements of anti-federalism is a complaint about the design of the Senate. We're going to talk more about the Senate when we get to Federalist number 62 and 63. But Brutus makes a big deal here about the equality of the states in the Senate. He says that's unfair because if you have a big state with a lot of people and a small state with fewer people, why should they both get 2 senators? Well, the reason I would argue this is inconsistent with elements of anti-federal thought is because that's actually a feature of a federal republic. Remember that this is actually a quality that the Articles of Confederation had. When small states and big states have an equality with one another, it suggests that they have sovereignty and that they are communities that have equally valuable ways of life. And so Brutus worries about this, even though it seems to undercut the anti-federalist belief in states' rights a little bit, him complaining about this. If you had inequality between the states and the big states got more and the small states got fewer in both houses of the Congress, not just the House, well, if you had that, you'd have something much more consolidated in its arrangement than the system Brutus is criticizing. So we'll talk more about that and the equality of the states when we get to Federalist 62 and 63. But there's some other things that Brutus criticizes about the Senate that are worth considering. He is disturbed by the lengthy term of 6 years as opposed to only 2 for the House. He is worried about the big powers that are given to the body. Remember that only the Senate has the power to ratify treaties that are designed by the president. Only the Senate has the power to confirm presidential appointments to the executive branch and many other exclusive powers that the Senate has. And he's also concerned that with this powerful body, it's a very small body. Is this not going to form a kind of a country club in politics that doesn't really feel connected to the people? He says, in his ideal system, he says they should not be so long in office as to be likely to forget the hand that formed them, or be insensible of their interests. Men long in office are very apt to feel themselves independent and to form and pursue interests separate from those who appointed them. And so he doesn't want senators to forget where they came from, but he thinks that these various features of the Senate's design are going to make that very likely, that they will forget where they came from. To us, we take for granted that there's going to be two chambers of a legislature. In other words, we have come to accept bicameralism as something that's pretty natural. Bicameralism, again, is just the idea that you have not one house of Congress, but two houses of Congress. So it's a bi structure. So to us, it's something we're used to. But when you think about it, bicameralism may not be quite so obvious as first meets the eye. When you break up the legislative power into two different houses, two houses, by the way, that are elected by totally different constituencies. Remember that the House, under the original design, is elected directly by the voters, and the Senate was intended, prior to the 17th Amendment, to be elected by the state legislatures. So you have two different houses elected by two different bodies. This is going to weaken it because they're two entirely separate institutions that you got to get on board to pass any legislation. When we study the progressives, we're going to see that the complexity of Congress is one reason they want to shift more power to the executive branch. And so we're used to bicameralism, but we don't necessarily keep in mind that to people like the anti-federalists, if you're breaking up the legislative power, you're going to weaken it. You're going to actually make it harder for legislatures to act in the name and in the interest of the people. So at the end of the day, what kind of Congress would anti-federalists have liked? Well, they would have wanted a unicameral Congress, one with only one house. And within that Congress, you would see representatives who have annual elections. So every year, they have to go up to the voters to keep their job. You would see that they have short terms of just 1 year. They would have a principle known as rotation in office, term limits, where they have to rotate out every so often and give the chance to go to Congress to someone else. And there would also be tools to make the representative depend on the state legislature. So instead of being a trustee representative who can act according to his own judgment to serve the good of the people as he sees fit, that's the trustee model that the Federalists like, they want to force these things that would make him more of a delegate. And so they would have given the state legislatures the power to recall representatives if they vote in ways that the state legislature doesn't like. They would have given legislatures the power to instruct representatives and to tell them how they got to vote. Well, this is interesting because it presents another dilemma in anti-federalist thought. The anti-federalists are states' rights guys. They want to see the state legislatures involved in the selection of legislatures and in the decisions that legislators make. But the anti-federalists are also populists. They also want to see representatives who are totally dependent on public opinion. What happens, though, if the state legislature and the mass opinion do not align with one another? What if the state legislatures and the public are not in sync? That often happens, right? Well, if the anti-federalists were to prioritize states' rights and state legislatures, then they would have to sacrifice something of their democratic principles and embrace, at least in a measure, something like the trustee theory, at least in part. But if they prioritize the wishes of mass opinion and of the constituents who put the state legislatures in place, well, this can come at a cost to the rights of the states. Eventually, it might be the case that we don't really need the state legislatures at all because we can just have the people directly vote on everything. And so that's a tension the anti-feds don't quite get right, or they don't quite address. And as I've also mentioned, there's also a big tension with that criticism of the equality of the states. The reason this is a problem for anti-federalists is that they criticize that for creating aristocracy. 2 senators per state is going to create a very small Senate that's going to be too small to represent the people. But at the same time, this equality between the states was regarded by the framers as the most states' rights-oriented feature of the new Constitution. If you don't want consolidation, or the creation of a very powerful national government, well, you really need to have equality between the states as a holdover from the Articles of Confederation. So why do they criticize it as oligarchical if they like states' rights? So the anti-Feds make a lot of good points, but there's also these interesting dilemmas in their thought that they don't quite address. So moving into the Federalists. Many of the tensions that I have already mentioned within the thought of the Anti-Federalists are acknowledged also by the authors of the Federalist. The Federalists have to show that this system of government that they have created with the Constitution protects representative principles of government. If they got this wrong, even if everything else about the Constitution were good, then the whole system is a disaster that should never be ratified. If the new Constitution doesn't create an effective Congress, then it's not truly Republican. It's not going to protect the liberties of the people, because liberty stands or falls with representative government. The Federalists, as much as the Anti-Federalists, would agree with that. And so naturally, a very lengthy portion of the Federalist Papers is going to deal with the principles of representative government and with the structure of the Congress. Federalists number 52 through 61 all focus on the design and the powers of the House of Representatives. James Madison, of all the founders, was a founder who thought especially hard about the philosophy of representation and of legislative power. And so it makes sense that he's going to be the guy that takes up the defense of the Constitution's design for the Congress. Conversely, Alexander Hamilton, who later becomes well known as a great defender of executive power, Hamilton is the guy who writes the Federalist essays dealing with executive powers. And so they divvied up their division of powers pretty well, where Madison, who's the expert on legislative government, deals with that. So you were only assigned Federalists 57 and 58, but I want to make sure I mention the big takeaways about all of these papers, because he mentions them in Federalist 57 and 58 as well. So in Federalist 55, Madison's big theme is that the House of Representatives is actually not too small to represent the people. He argues that it's moderate in its size. It's neither too small nor too big. It's not going to be so huge that the legislative body can't deliberate, but it's not going to be so small that it's unable to legislate with a view to the wishes of the people. So there's two extremes that he says the founders wanted to avoid. And so that's important to keep in mind. He says, no, this isn't too small. Actually, it's a pretty big legislature when you think about the caps that we have created. Federalist 56 says that, in Federalist 56, Madison takes up the criticism that representatives are going to be unable to sympathize with their constituents. They're not going to know what kinds of laws that they need. Madison deals with this by saying that in the first place, Anti-Federalists show that they're kind of confused about what the purpose of the Congress even is. This Congress isn't meant to legislate on every minute detail of every person's life. This is meant to be a pretty limited Congress that only handles those things that are within its enumerated powers. And so even if it were true that representatives wouldn't have a lot of knowledge about the quality of the roads in their district or something like that, well, that doesn't really matter, because that's irrelevant to the job description, according to Madison. He says, in this Congress, we're only going to deal with things that involve interstate commerce and foreign policy and all of those other things that the Congress has enumerated powers over. And so representatives don't necessarily need to know every detail about everything going on in their local and state governments, because those things are going to be handled by local and state representatives, not by the federal representatives. And so the only thing the federal representatives have to deal with are those enumerated powers. So that's Federalist 56. In Federalist 57, Madison takes up the argument that representatives, he wants to challenge the anti-federalist claim that representatives will never be able to actually represent their people. They'll be too elite. They'll be too wealthy. Madison deals with this by showing that actually the Constitution does not create a system where only elite oligarchs, so wealthy oligarchical people, those are not the only people who can become representatives under the Constitution. Actually, there are no property tests to serve in the Congress. It's open to anyone, no matter how much money they have. And actually, they have to go to the voters every 2 years. So if they are constantly acting in a way that is totally apart from the wishes of their constituents, then the voters can punish them. And so Madison says that the Anti-Federalists are totally understating the ties of duty, virtue, and interest that are going to give the representatives a connection to the represented. Madison says that you Anti-Federalists have a pretty dark view about the intentions of your own voters. Are the voters really going to be electing, Madison queries, such horrible people to the Congress all the time? Do we not have the virtue necessary to elect decent representatives? If we don't, then really our problems transcend the Constitution and they just run right at the heart of Republican government and dequalify us from having it. But even if we look at something less lofty than virtue, the virtue of the people, even if we look at something like self-interest, then anti-federalist arguments against the Congress still falter, according to Madison, because he says that congressmen are going to be bound by the virtue of their regular re-elections to win the affection of their constituents. Remember that the framers who were Federalists, they rejected term limits. Madison says this is a feature, not a bug. We don't want term limits. Because if you have term limits, then you get into office and you're not invested in your own success or in the success of the institution. If you have to worry that you'll just be booted out after 2 years, well, you're not always going to really care about what you're voting on because it's not really going to make a difference to your career with or without this vote. And so the regular re-election of congressmen is going to guarantee that they have some interest in serving their constituents. And so, ironically, something the anti-federalists want, which is term limits, Madison argues that actually that would be bad for connecting representatives to the people. We want the people to be able to vote in their representative as much as they want to. And this will tie representatives to their constituents in those bonds of interest. If representatives are always betraying the trust of their people, then the voters don't have to send them back. But if they do, our problems run deeper than just the Constitution, but they really touch the fabric of our commitment to Republican government. Federalist 58, he's responding to the argument that the size of the House is not going to properly change as the population expands. Well, that argument is pretty weak, I think, and Madison observes that actually the census is going to be conducted every 10 years to ensure that the size of the House is going to change every 10-year cycle. And this is still true today. We still have censuses every 10 years. A more interesting part of Federalist 58 is the part where he returns to what has been a major theme of his Federalist essays. Namely, his emphasis on moderation and balance in government. Madison again mentions this point that if the House is too large, it's going to be democratic in theory, but oligarchic in practice. And so in a way, he's turning the anti-federalist argument on its head. He's showing that if you have what the anti-federalists want put into practice, it actually results in the kind of oligarchy that they claim to oppose. So what does he mean by this? Well, he means that when you have a huge and massive assembly in a legislative body, So let's say you have a Congress that's not 400 people, but it's more like 3,000 people. Madison says that this is the kind of Congress that's going to be far too subject to the control of a small group of powerful demagogues. So people who are skilled orators, or maybe they were great generals who are really popular with the people. These kinds of people who can use their popularity or their rhetorical skills to basically dominate the lesser representatives and tell them what to do. It's not going to be a deliberative body if it gets too large. It's actually going to be kind of dominated by this small clique of powerful people who don't really care about the needs of their constituents, but really just want to dominate the government by themselves. So that's one extreme. If it's too large, then it will be democratic in theory, but oligarchic in practice. But if the House is too small, Madison actually agrees with the Anti-Federalists that it won't be able to reflect the views of a large, diverse, and extended republic. Madison says, of course I agree that a representative ought to have a sense of attachment to the represented. So he's not arguing for a total distance between rulers and ruled here. Madison's point is just that we want moderation. We want something that combines the virtues of deliberation in a moderately sized assembly with the virtues of representation of different parts. So Madison is kind of like Goldilocks here, right? He doesn't want it to be too hot or too cold. He wants it to be just right, just in the middle. So if that's the defense of the House, what about the Senate? I'll try to wrap up as quickly as I can because this has been a long lecture because of just the size of the readings. But this is a fun part of the readings, and I think a very important part. The Senate is an incredibly important body for understanding the design of the founders and the function of modern American politics. Recall that in our discussion of Federalist Number 1 a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the importance of reflection and choice to the founders. Remember that in Federalist 1, Alexander Hamilton speaks of the establishment of the Constitution as something that will prove to the world that a republican government based on reflection and choice, based upon reason and deliberation, is a possibility. One important theme of the Federalist is this theme of reflection and choice. But it's not only something that defines the moment of the founding, it's meant to be the guiding principle of our whole constitutional institution. And so reflection and choice was meant to be built into the structure of our institutions. The Senate is an important way that this plays out. The Senate was created in order to make the Congress more deliberative in its character. It was meant to offset the more democratic House of Representatives with a body that was more aristocratic in the best sense of that word. It was not meant to be aristocratic in the European sense of having only wealthy elites or landed aristocrats. It was aristocratic in the sense that it was meant to be a body that would be more wise and more virtuous than the House. And so the Senate is critical to effecting this vision of a constitutional system that promotes deliberation and reflection and choice. It's meant to offset the democratic passions of the House of Representatives and infuse the government with an air of stability and moderation that it otherwise would not have. And so the Senate, it really kills two birds with one stone. On the one hand, it checks the excesses of democracy that are going to emanate from the House of Representatives by virtue of the fact that it is more closely connected to mass opinion. It's directly elected, it's subject to the 2-year term, and these kinds of things. And so the House is more democratic. The Senate is meant to be something of a safeguard against its excessive democratic impulses. But at the same time, the Senate was also meant to serve an equally important purpose of protecting the rights of the states and embedding the federal structure into the Constitution. The Senate was meant to represent the states, not the voters. This is something that is very important to understand. The the Senate, by virtue of the fact that states are represented equally and under the original system were appointed by the state legislatures and not chosen by the voters, these were things that meant that the Senate would have a natural inclination to protecting the rights of the states against encroachments by a federal government. And so both of these purposes were very important to the founders. In Federalist 62 and 63, Madison explains how the Senate actually does these things. He deals with 5 major points in these essays: the qualifications to serve in the Senate, the appointment of the Senate by the state legislatures, the equality of representation in the Senate, 2 senators per state, the number of senators and then their lengthy 6-year term, and the powers of the Senate when compared to those of the House. Each of these elements has a kind of logic to it that justifies the design of the Senate against anti-federalist claims that it's going to be a dangerously aristocratic institution. So let's start with qualifications. So to be qualified to serve in the Senate, you have to be 30 years old and you have to be a citizen for at least 9 years. This is different than the House of Representatives, where you have to be 25 years old and you have to be a citizen for 7 years. So why have this discrepancy? Why make it the case that in the House you can be 25, but in the Senate you can be 30? By the way, I do think it's a little funny in hindsight that we think the founders regarded 30 as being wise and older and experienced, but today the Senate is full of 80-year-olds and people who are literally dying in office because they're staying so long. So, we see that there's something going on here that they didn't envision. But in any case, why have this discrepancy where you can be younger in the House and you don't have to be a citizen for as long? Well, the founders thought that the Senate needed to be wiser. It needed to be full of people with more life experience. If you require that they be 5 years older, it's going to make it more likely that you'll have senators who have some experience and knowledge about the world. Additionally, and this is connected to the length of citizenship status, the Senate deals with a lot of foreign policy issues, especially when compared to the House of Representatives. So it makes sense for them to require that you be a citizen for at least 9 years before you serve in the Senate. So you can be an immigrant, right? One approach to this would have just been to say immigrants can't serve ever, but the founders rejected that. No, the founders thought, we do want to make it so that if you immigrate into the United States and you're talented and patriotic, you can take up a term in the Senate at some point. But at the same time, we don't want it to happen immediately. You have to be a citizen for at least 9 years, because that's going to demonstrate that's going to make you a more loyal person to the United States. Think for a moment about how if immigrants could serve immediately after they naturalized, it would make it possible for them to basically be foreign nationals who come to the Senate and use it to help their former country rather than help the United States. They want to avoid something like that, but they also want to avoid a total exclusion of immigrants from the Senate. And so that's why you have a steeper requirement to be a citizen for 9 years rather than 7 in the Senate. Now, the next thing to discuss is the appointment of the Senate by state legislatures. It's worth recognizing that Madison's defense of this is a little tepid. It's somewhat weak compared to what you might see in other founders. This is also true of his defense of the equality between the states. It's worth pointing this out because at the convention, Madison argued strongly against both of these things. He was not in the states' rights party in Philadelphia, but was very suspicious of the states and actually wanted to keep them out. And so it's somewhat unsurprising here that he actually speaks somewhat like he defends these things, but not in the most robust way he possibly can. But nonetheless, he does offer good points about them. So the state legislatures, one thing he raises that's a good point about what this does. The state legislatures appointing senators is going to give the state governments an agency in the federal system. No law can pass without the tacit assent of the states as they are represented in the Senate. This is going to legitimize the laws to the state governments and ensure their swift enforcement at the state level. And so the appointment of the Senate by the states is going to link the states with the federal government. It's going to generate a kind of mutual confidence in the states for the federal system and vice versa, because they're linked together in this interesting way within the Senate. Madison says this will preserve a federal system that keeps the confidence of the people and the state authorities alike. I like a later Federalist essay by John Jay. I think it's Federalist 64, maybe 65, where John Jay adds that state legislatures are going to be more likely to send men of wisdom and virtue to the upper house than you would have in a direct election. John Jay, who had made his career in the state government of New York, says that the states are going to know who the best men of the community are. They're going to reward their talent and their long service to the state government with an appointment to the Senate. And so Jay believes that the cream of the crop is going to be more likely to be sent to the Senate because of this indirect election by the state legislatures. So what about the equality of representation in the Senate? This is another part of the Senate's design that Madison defends a little weakly compared to what you might see in John Jay or in some other founders. Well, Madison, he had, at the convention, thought it was unfair for states like Virginia to have the same amount of representatives in the Senate that a state like New Jersey would. That said, Madison does present arguments for it because he understands he has to speak for the consensus of the framers, not just his own personal perspective. So here's a practical reason he immediately opens with about the equality between the states and the Senate. He says practically it was necessary. Without it, you don't have any chance that the Constitution passes in Philadelphia, and you don't have any chance that enough states are going to ratify it to put it into effect. And so it was a necessary compromise. But he also provides arguments that are more principled for it. He says the equality between the states and the Senate is going to protect the compound character of the Constitution, the mixed character of the Constitution. It's going to ensure that the Constitution is national in some areas, but federal in others. The House reflects America's national character because it is representative. The representatives are done by population. Big states get more, small states get less. But the Senate is the structural embodiment of federalism. It's the protector of the states. And so it needs to respect the sovereignty of the states by providing for this equality between the states. That's the way you create a system that's going to please both the large states and the small states. And so at the end of the day, even if the small states are going to control the Senate or have disproportionate weight in the Senate, well, you're going to have a House of Representatives where the large states have more power. And so the large states are going to be done by the House of Representatives is designed according to population, while the Senate is based on equality between the states. And basically, no side gets everything at once. The large states don't get to call the shots in every way, but the small states don't get to call the shots in every way either. They have to make compromises with one another, and at the end of the day, laws are going to have to require the assent of the House and the Senate to go into effect. And so this is going to protect the common good and make it more likely that legislation will please everyone, not just the large states and not just the small states. So lastly, the number of senators, or not lastly, second to lastly, the number of senators and the 6-year term length. In the House, you have to worry about re-election every 2 years. there isn't a single election cycle where you could not, at least in theory, be vulnerable to challengers. In the Senate, your term is a whole 6 years. And so because there are only 2 senators per state, and because every senator goes up or each senator within the state, so each of the 2 senators within the state go up to a different so there are only 2 senators in each state, and within that state both senators go up in a different election cycle. The effect of this is to guarantee that with each election cycle, only 1/3 of the whole Senate is ever vulnerable. And so this is why in each election cycle, you never see 2 open seats in a single state. Senators go up at different times. So why is this worth mentioning? Well, the reason why is because you can have a massive landslide election in a presidential year. So imagine 2024. Imagine it was even more of a blowout than it was, where one party had a totally dominating performance at every level and carried massive majorities in the House and in the Electoral College. Well, in the Senate, because of this way that it's structured, where every election cycle only 1/3 of the Senate goes up, you only have a shot at picking up 1/3 of the seats. So even if a party totally dominates the other, the Senate is still going to move much more slowly, because every election cycle only 1/3 of the Senate goes up for re-election. 2/3 of the whole Senate is safe, no matter which election cycle you're dealing with. And this means that it's going to be more likely to put the brakes on radical legislation and be a force for moderation in government. Sometimes this frustrates both parties. New Deal Democrats were often frustrated by Senate Democrats who were more conservative than the party leaders were. More recently, some Republicans wanted more spending cuts in Trump's big, beautiful bill, but they were unable to get them because there were several Republicans in the Senate who were worried about the effect of spending cuts on their constituents. And so this frustration, however bipartisan it is, it nonetheless shouldn't conceal the fact that there's actually some virtues to the slowness of the Senate. It's much harder for bad legislation to get passed because the Senate is always going to be disposed to moderation. And it's also going to be more likely that when legislation does pass, it's going to be good for all the people. So the last thing Madison mentions is the vast power of the Senate. The Senate's power is an element of it that gives it a respectable standing in the eyes of other nations. They have to consider the powers of the Senate when they craft their treaties because the Senate is going to ratify those treaties. Madison says, well, the powers of the Senate are not too extreme because the House of Representatives has exclusive power over originating spending and taxing bills. So there's one power that the House has that the Senate doesn't have. So last thoughts as I wrap up. Sorry for this being a fairly long lecture, but there were a lot of quiz points you had to know, and the lectures or the readings were pretty involved this week. So I'll just briefly conclude here. The political science of the Constitution is all about what Madison calls the deliberative sense of the community. It's not just about fulfilling the immediate wishes of mass opinion. What the founders understood is that sometimes the people themselves can be a threat to their own liberty. We have to create a system that makes it safe for the people to rule in order to preserve the virtues of popular Republican government and guard against its very vices. In many ways, we have lost sight of this idea completely in our own time. We often hear complaints that the Constitution is not democratic enough, and these complaints usually criticize institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College. The founders would say that these institutions make democracy safe for the people. They're not things that endanger democracy, but in fact make it possible. With the rise of progressivism in the early 1900s, the 17th Amendment was passed and direct election of senators became established. So all this stuff that we've read from the founders about the importance of the state legislatures choosing senators, some of you may have read that and wondered, well, why do we not do that anymore? Well, it's because of the 17th Amendment and direct election of senators becoming established by that amendment. This was one of the most serious and radical structural changes to our whole constitutional system in the history of constitutional amendments, because it undercut one of the most important principles of the founders, which was the principle of federalism. Today, the states no longer have this important role in the federal government that links them to it. They can't send senators to Washington that can be trusted to represent their interests and values. Senators have to build independent constituencies of support with voters who are in many ways moved by the same exact passions as those that move elections for the House of Representatives. So the Senate has become more like the House of Representatives and less deliberative since the 17th Amendment. Unsurprisingly, too, with this democratization of the Senate has come a steady expansion of the power of the federal government. Especially the power of the presidency and the executive branch. The Senate is no longer interested in guarding against consolidation because why should they be? The state legislatures don't have anything to do with them anymore. And so senators are no longer interested in guarding against consolidation, but sometimes actually advance that cause for their own electoral gain. Sometimes big government is popular with the voters in a way maybe it wouldn't have been had the state legislatures continue to choose senators. At the end of the day, one thing is certain. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike would both agree that without a strong Congress, we can't have a strong America. We can't have strong republicanism. Which of the sides you support may say something about whether or not you emphasize moderation, deliberation, and virtue in legislative assemblies, as the Federalists did, or whether you prefer a government that's more closely tied to public opinion. In instructing us about representative government, this debate teaches us something very important about democracy. I will see you guys next week, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a great week. Until next time, bye-bye.